Financial Survival Network, helping you survive and thrive in the new economy. Go to CarrieLutz.com and sign up for 30 free micro trainings on financial survival.
$14.90 WGCH. This is Carrie Lutz. You're listening to the Financial Survival Network. Have you been wondering, is the world going to revert and go back to a gold standard? My next guest believes there's a golden revolution that's about to take place. He's written a book, The Golden Revolution. John Butler, how are you?
Fine, Carrie. Thanks.
Hey, so we're on the cusp is what you seem to be implying. Oh, and by the way, the book's not out yet. It can be pre-ordered on Amazon. So you're saying we're on the cusp of a reversion, as I said, like Yogi Berra always said, it's deja vu all over again. We're going back to the gold standard. You're convinced of that, right?
Absolutely. The evidence has been accumulating for years. I believe it is now overwhelming. Said it's not the sort of evidence that most policymakers, including central bankers, necessarily care to look at least to look at objectively and honestly. But when you step back and survey where we've been, where we are, and think about it intelligently, it becomes quite evident where we're going, and we are going back onto gold.
And what do you think the main reason is why we're going to re-embrace a gold standard?
Well, keep in mind that the gold standard, which existed most recently in the world, was that under the Bretton Woods agreements, which were put together in 1944, when it was increasingly clear that the U.S. and its allies were going to win the Second World War and would have to reconstruct a global monetary order. And so the U.S. imposed is a strong word, but in historical fact, it's more or less what it was. The U.S. imposed the Bretton Woods arrangements on the victorious Allied powers with the understanding that, yes, the U.S. dollar would be linked to gold, as indeed it had been linked to gold prior to the Second World War, and that other currencies would then link to the U.S. dollar. So when Nixon abruptly ended gold convertibility in August of 1971, we left the gold standard behind, but it was a very U.S.-centric gold standard. The U.S. was the monetary hegemon, as it were, that was running that system. What you have today is very different. You're in a situation where the U.S. economy has lost its economic hegemonic status. And this is not to say that the U.S. is not still the biggest economy in the world. It is. But if you look at the U.S. share of global GDP, for example, it's substantially lower than it was in 1944. And indeed, it's been declining also in recent years with the rise of the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and also others. But the point is this, is that the U.S. dollar is still the single most important reserve currency in the world. I mean, currency in general, but specifically reserve currency. It is the currency that is overwhelmingly held by other central banks as a reserve, that is an asset, held against their liabilities, which is their own currencies. And what that effectively means is that the edifice of global money and credit, the edifice of the global banking system, the global financial system, really rests on this foundation of dollars. But then, this is the problem. Now, the U.S. economy has serious issues. The U.S. financial system has serious issues. And we know this as a result of the excessive money and credit growth, the excessive speculation, and of course the real estate bubble and bust, which have ensued, but which have now been met with multiple years of very expansionary Federal Reserve policy, creating money, obviously, to try to paper over the problems, to maintain liquidity. And this has now so tremendously undermined trust in the stability of the dollar as a store of value that it has, by extension, undermined the current global monetary order. And without that trust in the dollar, with that trust in the dollar crumbling, you're going to have something else to take the dollar's place. And when you work your way through the arguments, which I'm sure we're about to do, it leads you back to a gold standard.
Right. So you don't think it's a barbarous relic of the past. And also, I guess trust really figures into this, because if you can't trust any central banker to do the right thing, can you?
Well, I mean, it's a very blanket statement. Sadly, history gives you an awful lot of evidence to support it. I think there are some central bankers in the world that are, in fact, reasonably responsible people. That said, they're operating within a system which, as I mentioned, depends on the stability and the credibility and the trust in the dollar. And with U.S. authorities clearly willing to sacrifice the strength of the dollar in order to support the financial system, to bail out the U.S. banks, and to try to paper over the fundamental economic problems that have been created through years of resource misallocation in the U.S., sadly, those handful of perhaps honest central bankers in the world are unable to really make much of a difference as things stand now. That said, they may play a bit more of a role in the transition back to gold, which I think is already underway behind the scenes, and which will become more prominent as we get through this year and next year.
Right. So we're getting closer and closer, and hopefully the so-called honest central bankers, if that's not a complete oxymoron, are going to assert themselves. So what about the transition and living standards around the world? Because it's going to have an effect on that, isn't it?
Well, certainly. I mean, look, this is not, let's accept a bit of harsh reality here. And I mean, you're well aware of this. The fact is, the world, in particular, certain economies such as the United States, but the world at large has been consuming at a rate which is probably unsustainable. And there are many different ways in which to approach this. But taken as a whole, the world has probably been consuming more than is sustainable. And it's only logical, therefore, that the rate of consumption growth will be lower in future. But what has enabled this? What has enabled this excessive consumption to take place in recent years? Well, it's been money and credit growth. It's been the illusion of wealth, right? Wealth illusion generated by central banks in various ways, finding ways to slip additional pieces of paper into people's wallets or without them necessarily noticing. And people see those additional pieces of paper, although it's largely electronic, of course, in this day and age, and they think, oh, I have a little bit more disposable income. I have a bit more to spend. So they go out and spend it. They don't realize that in the background, their wealth, their savings, is being eroded through inflation. So they consume too much and save too little. And this accumulates over time into a large imbalance, which is unsustainable. So even if we don't go back onto a gold standard, this imbalance is going to have to correct. However, one consequence of the trust and credibility issues that I mentioned earlier is that, indeed, as these imbalances correct, it's almost inevitable, that we go back onto gold. So the two are related. They probably will occur simultaneously, but it's not as if going back onto a gold standard causes the wealth reduction. It is simply associated with this excessive consumption, this money illusion, and the underlying monetary inflation, which has enabled all of the above.
Right. So do you see a role for silver in this emerging new monetary regime?
I do, but it is more likely to be an unofficial than official role, at least at first. Now, keep in mind that the experience of the United States in monetary affairs is obviously unique to the United States. Every country has gone through its own periods of either being on a gold standard or not being on a gold standard, or using silver coinage or not using silver coinage. That said, if you look at history, on balance, on average, countries and societies have relied more on silver coinage than on gold coinage as money. in a large part because silver was simply more abundant and therefore was more useful for everyday transactions, whereas gold, being considerably scarcer, was reserved more for religious and cultural purposes. It's no accident that as you travel around the world, religious and holy sites tend to be decorated with, in some cases, pretty significant amounts of gold. Well, keep in mind, right, back in ancient times, there was, far less gold had been pulled out of the ground, and, that's where it was going, right? It went to these religious and sacred sites, which were not, of course, of direct commercial use. It's not as if people were trading these things back and forth. It was, silver was serving as money. However, as you moved into the modern age where shipping grew tremendously, what you found is that the ability to move gold from place to place became much, much easier by the late Middle Ages, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and so on. And you eventually got to a point where silver would circulate domestically as coinage, but when it came to settling international balance of payments, it actually was far easier to transport gold, right? You could transport a greater amount of wealth in the whole of a ship in the form of gold than in silver. So silver was circulating domestically, gold was circulating more internationally, and if we indeed are moving back onto a gold standard in the coming years, which I believe, again, this is already underway, I think from an official point of view, it begins with gold. Country by country, there may be decisions made to allow silver coinage to circulate, but that is in my opinion, far more difficult thing to predict.
Right. And what about electronic gold, digital gold, like goldmoney.com? Is that what you're anticipating? Because it's not real practical always to be carrying a pocket full of gold coins, especially on the international level when, these trade imbalances have to be made up presumably in gold, right?
Oh, yes, indeed. And so while I believe that as we move back onto a gold standard, I believe the initial step will be for gold to be used in official international balance of payment transactions. But once that happens, then certainly in some countries, and it would personally be my preference if this were to happen essentially everywhere, but one step at a time, countries will allow perhaps actual direct use of money, of gold and silver. And if that occurs, and I think it should occur, I think it makes fundamental economic sense for it to occur, then this is where modern technology is really going to be a wonderful thing for money and commerce, because one of the criticisms, which is completely unfairly leveled at the concept of a gold standard, is that, and one of the reasons why people think gold is a barbarous relic is because they think it is simply inefficient to have to be transporting physical gold all over the place as transactions take place. And what these people fail to realize is that, in fact, that argument, that is that gold is cumbersome for modern commerce and trade, actually has completely gone out the window with electronic payment systems. And as you point out, gold money is one example. There are other examples of ways in which you could simply have an electronic account which is linked to the price of gold or linked to the price of silver in some way, and from which you debit or credit, in theory, infinitesimally small amounts of gold and silver to be able to make even the tiniest little transactions. And this is something which is simply not appreciated. Modern technology makes a gold and or silver standard and the use of gold and or silver as money far easier than it was back in the 19th century and previously, when gold and silver coinage was the primary money. It would be even easier today, and I think that's generally underappreciated.
Yeah, so if you had that American Express gold card, it really might have some gold backing it up then, huh?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and that's, if you've followed Peter Schiff at all, he's setting up an offshore bank where you'll be able to deposit gold as your choice of currency, and you'll have an ATM card which will make payments and deduct the gold from your account, the actual weight. So whether all this can take place before a collapse is kind of my question, because you got Gresham's law, which is actually developed by Copernicus, but it's been around before that, which says that the bad money forces out the good. So as long as bad money, in quotes, has purchasing power, it's not going to allow the good money in, is it?
Well, no, and this is the purpose of legal tender laws, right? I mean, legal tender laws would be completely unnecessary if people were allowed to use whatever money they actually wanted to use. Legal tender laws exist to basically force people to use an inferior money, a money which they would not necessarily prefer to use. In the United States experience, the first legal tender laws came into effect during the Civil War. President Lincoln, of course, was struggling to finance this hugely expensive conflict at a time when the federal government was still tiny relative to the country as a whole. And, of course, the federal government lost a huge amount of revenue when the South seceded because the external tariffs were one of the primary revenue sources in any event. So one of the things Lincoln did to help finance the Civil War was to issue these greenbacks, which were not explicitly backed by gold. They were simply backed by a U.S. sort of government sort of promise to pay at some point in the future. And at the same time, the debate in Congress was going on about these greenbacks, and people were saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, you can print all these greenbacks you want, but people won't accept them. And that's when, of course, the idea came in, we'll simply force people to accept them. And so the U.S. experience with legal tender laws came in with these greenbacks. We take, of course, legal tender laws for granted today. But really what you're saying is absolutely correct. And one of the results or effects of going back onto gold standards is going to be is that when it comes to international transactions and settling balance of payments, there will be actual choice involved. I mean, once people choose to go back onto a gold standard, I mean, they actually are using what they want to be using. And again, domestically, you might still have your legal tender laws, but in theory, there's going to be pressure. And in some countries, the pressure will be more effective than others to actually allow the domestic populace to use gold and silver as money. Again, it's very hard to predict exactly which countries will make that decision and which won't. But going back onto a gold standard for at least international transactions is a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, so it's kind of hallelujah time, because once it starts, it's probably going to be unstoppable. And you raised a great point, John, and that is that for much of this country, the United States' history, there were no legal tender laws, and people used the type of money that they chose to use. And it became a convenience issue, because originally we were using, the Spanish coin, was it the denario? Is that Roman? I don't remember. But
the dollar, which was also known as pieces of 8. Basically, it was divisible into 8 sections.
Yeah, which became known as bits. So when you said 2 bits, that was a quarter, and
right.
That's so ingrained in the history, and yet nobody knows it. So for a lot of the country's history, we got by without the government telling us what money was. And one could argue that it really got bad. Things really started to go downhill once the Federal Reserve was created, and they delegated the whole authority of who decides what money is. So, it's the more things change, I guess, the more they stay the same.
Yes, indeed. And I think history is instructive in this regard. And one of the things that I do early on in the book is to try to give people a sense of just how far we've come. And one very easy way to do that is to contrast the first official definition of a U.S. dollar with the definition of a dollar which exists today. Now, the first official definition of the U.S. dollar comes from the Coinage Act of 1792, where it was specified exactly how many grains of silver or exactly how many grains of gold made up a U.S. dollar. So the U.S. dollar was defined as a specific weight of silver or a specific weight of gold. Today, of course, the definition of a dollar is what you read on a Federal Reserve note. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's it.
Yeah.
That's how far we've come. So, it's been one small step at a time. In some cases, the steps, however, have been larger. As you point out, the creation of the Federal Reserve was a very large step. For example, Nixon closing the gold window in August 1971 was a large step, for example. But there have been lots of other little steps along the way. Subtleties in banking regulation, subtleties in payment systems regulation, all sorts of things which have, in their own way, led us to the sort of present, I would say, sorry state of affairs, where the dollar is something which is manipulated to whatever ends the powers that be would manipulate it to. But again, this can only go so far. The fact is, it's a global economy. The U.S.'s share of economic power in that global economy is an order of magnitude lower than it used to be. Now, while that might disappoint some Americans, the silver lining, as it were, is that it no longer allows the U.S. to function as a monetary hegemon. And you see, over the past couple of years, some very, very provocative statements coming from policymakers, including heads of state in China, in Russia, in Brazil, in both Germany and France, in some of the oil-producing countries, basically saying that U.S. monetary policy is destabilizing the global economy. Those are strong words. And so it's not only that it's increasingly clear in the statistics that the U.S. has lost its hegemonic economic status, it's clear in the political rhetoric around the world. And as more and more countries decide that U.S. monetary policy is not in their interest, they will find ways to distance themselves from the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. And, these sorts of developments can be very sudden, very nonlinear. A tipping point is a metaphor that comes to mind. I like to use the concept of a Nash equilibrium, where sometimes just one small country or a few small countries slightly changing their stance in monetary policy can cause, by extension, large countries to change their stance. And if you get multiple large countries changing their stance, then this completely spirals out of control, at least from the U.S. perspective. And before you know it, the dollar will be deposed as the reserve currency in favor of either gold directly or indirectly, because other countries start pegging their currencies to gold. Again, we're getting a lot closer to this than people appreciate. But if you look at the signs, the writing on the wall, and in some cases, explicit statements, the evidence is increasingly in favor of this view.
Right. So the book will be out shortly, we understand. It's been fast-tracked?
Yes, indeed. John Wiley and Sons, as you know, is a major publisher. They're producing any number of books at the same time, and they naturally, as any large publisher, they're trying to get a sense of what they think is likely to sell, and they've selected this particular book for what they call fast track publication. They've determined that the topic is extremely timely, and so they're trying to accelerate the production schedule. Something which made my holidays rather inconvenient this year. I found out in mid-December that I was going to have to basically complete all content editing, that is all substantial editing, of the manuscript by the 6th of January. And unfortunately, my wife and other members of my family didn't see a lot of me between Christmas and New Year's as a result.
Well, some might think that that's a really good problem to have, and we wish you the best of luck on the book. When it comes out, I am going to obtain a copy. I will actually read it, and I'm going to have you back on so we can really discuss some of the finer points, and we'll be that much further along in this transition phase, so we'll be able to relate it more to what's going on at the time than what's happening right now. So anyway, John, you have a website or a email address people can reach you at?
Yes, indeed. People who are interested in the book, well, they can. There's already an Amazon page for the book. If you simply want to go straight straight to Amazon and get a description of the book. But if you'd like to learn a little bit more about myself, about my sort of monetary philosophy in general, I do have other writings in that I produce a regular newsletter called the Amphora Report, and that the archive for that report exists on my website, which is www.amphora-alpha.com. That is AMPHORA-alpha.com. And my personal email address is john.butler@amphoraalpha.com.
All right. Well, hey, great having you on. We're going to check out your website. We'll put it on our links in our financial survival toolkit that we send out to subscribers. People, you can go to kerrylutz.com, listen to this interview more, download it, and all the other things we've got there. All right, John, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Kerry.